So here we are talking about our last distinctive, part 4 of this conversation about what defines and drives healthy Christian communities. So we talked about, firstly, gospel-centeredness. Everything else is a downstream symptom of that. As we understand how God in Christ has been to us, so we are to each other and the rest of the world. That sets in right perspective and gives us an ongoing motivation to pursue everything else that God's called us to do. And secondly, our communities ought to be defined by a sense of authenticity, real people struggling to follow a real Jesus. And then last time we talked about what it looks like to live on mission and asked ourselves and began to pray and seek the Lord on what it might look like for our group, our community, to live life on mission together. And this time we're looking at the end of Acts chapter 2, where all of this has come from, this picture of early church community. And it says at the end of the passage, they were praising God and having favor with all of the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. Well, then what then? What do you do with these people who are being added to your number? Well, this last distinctive of Christian community and healthy gospel-centered community is multiplication. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, Paul commands Timothy, a young pastor, to be about the business of gospel-centered multiplication in this way. He says, "You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus." Don't forget the gospel. Remember the gospel of grace. "And then what you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men and women who will be able to teach others also." So there's 4 generations there. There's Paul who's teaching Timothy, Timothy who's teaching others, and those others are teaching others. So there's spiritual generations in view in Christian community. So when we talk about multiplication, we're not talking about a group gets too big and so we divide it down the middle, we have a draft, who wants who, we pick teams, and then now we have 2 groups. That's not the process of multiplication. What we're talking about is multiplication in 3 ways. We want to make disciples. So as our group is concerned about those who don't know Jesus around us, there ought to be those, like in Acts 2:42, who are being saved. So that's one way that we multiply, is through making disciples. Then we want to mature disciples. This is the reality that every person who's following Jesus ought to be discipled by somebody and ought to be discipling someone else, helping someone else follow Jesus while somebody else is helping you follow Jesus. So we want to make disciples and then mature disciples. And that happens the best in the context of smaller community groups. And then thirdly, we want to multiply leaders. So we want to make disciples, mature disciples, and then multiply leaders. So don't be scared if your leader comes to you one day and taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, have you ever considered leading a small group before?" Don't get nervous. Just pray about it. They're supposed to be asking you those questions. What we ought to be doing, and I want to ask you to consider, are you pursuing someone to disciple you, to be sort of have them multiply themselves into you? Are you pursuing someone to disciple? Are we praying for and concerned about those who don't know Jesus and investing in their lives to love them and point them towards Jesus? And then are we aspiring to potentially one day lead a community like this? We ought to be. Some of us, it will happen in the next 6 months. Some of it will happen in the next 6 years or 16 years. But we ought to be aspiring to, asking the Lord, how would you use me to lead a group in the future? And then leaders ought to be always looking for, God, who would you be raising up around me? Who should I be inviting into this journey? So when we talk about multiplication, we're going to talk about making disciples, maturing disciples, and multiplying leaders. And when that happens, then groups will multiply. And if we remember, this is God's plan to accomplish the Great Commission. Every disciple making disciples, every community reproducing itself into another community, and every church planting churches. This is God's missional plan to get the good news of the gospel to the nations. And so praying for you as you endure and enjoy this journey that God has called you to.